that courtroom where she witnessed Hunter Biden being read that verdict. And Erica, I know you've been in the courtroom for much of this trial. Tell us what you saw today.
Yeah, so as the jury filed into that courtroom, Hunter Biden, he stood up. He had his hands crossed in front of him, and then the courtroom deputy actually delivered the verdict. We didn't hear it from the foreperson or another member of the jury. So as that verdict was actually read by the courtroom deputy, Hunter Biden stayed seated with his attorneys next to him. He was looking directly at the courtroom deputy. He distributed very little emotion. We didn't notice anything major, just watching as each guilty their verdict came down. And then after the verdict was delivered, he touched both of his attorneys, hugged them. His wife behind him, after it was over, he hugged them. He hugged her, embraced her. So during this process, he exhibited very little emotion. For the most part, he was just paying attention, and then afterward, reaching over to both of his attorneys, Abby Lowell, David Kalansky, thanking them.
Erica Brown, thank you for that. I want to bring in Robert Costa, our chief campaign and election correspondent. And Robert, we've been through many unprecedented times with not only Joe Biden and Donald Trump, but now this presents a significant step for Hunter Biden in his recovery, as well as the president's reelection.
That's exactly right, Nora. Throughout American history, we've seen presidential family members run into trouble, whether it's Billy Carter or Roger Clinton. What makes the Hunter Biden situation and this conviction so different, based on my conversations with those very close to President Biden, is that Hunter is so close to the president. You think about the history they've shared together going back to late 1972, when Hunter's mother, Joe Biden's first wife, killed in a car accident, bonded Beau and Hunter to their father at that moment, closer than ever. And he has remained so close to the president while the President Biden has been in the White House, a fixture often inside the residence at the White House, on vacations, on flights with the president. And so when I talk to people close to Biden, they say this is a legal proceeding, but it's also a personal proceeding, that the president feels a lot of pain about the reckoning his son has dealt with addiction issues over the years. And he wants to be there for his son, even as he runs for re-election, deals with former President Trump and all of the issues throughout the world. People who know Biden say you really can't talk about how much Hunter's on the mind of the president every day.
If you know President Biden, he calls his children and his grandchildren every single day. He is a family man who stays very close with his kids. Let me ask you, though, Robert, recently President Biden gave an interview where he said he would not pardon Hunter Biden if convicted. And we will see if that position holds in the coming months. Pardons are something that can be discussed, deliberated. A position can change. For now, that is the president's position. But presidents often issue pardons to those who are close to them, those who they feel might deserve a second chance. So I don't rule out as a reporter that decision being reconsidered in the coming year or so. But at this time, the president is saying no pardon for his son, but that was before the conviction took place. And he was not asked, the president was not asked to follow up about whether he would commute Hunter Biden's sentence, which would also be an option under presidential powers. Let me also bring in Scott McFarland, who's there outside the courthouse. He has some more information about sentencing. What can you tell us, Scott?
Yeah, the judge said she has not going to set a firm sentencing date this moment, but estimated sentencing would be about 120 days from now. And that's usually the rhythm and pattern of the federal courts. It's about 3 to 4 months after a guilty verdict that a sentencing hearing is held. 120 days puts you right in the heart of October, right on the precipice of the election. You'll note that former President Trump has his sentencing just days before the Republican National Convention. Hunter Biden could have his sentencing just days before the election. And in the federal system, it's incredibly rare for a defendant to be immediately what they call stepped back, brought immediately to a federal prison facility. It would likely that Hunter Biden, if he were sentenced to prison, would have some lag time before he'd have to report, which could put that right at the precipice of the end of the term of this presidency. So you have a lot of variables at play as they go to sentencing. We'll add also from our team in the courtroom itself, the president's sister, Valerie Biden, stepped in just after the sentencing was announced. Jimmy Biden was there for the verdict. The First Lady of the United States was not here today. She was here, though, for 5 of the 6 days of trial.
Scott McFarland, thank you. Worth noting that Valerie Biden is not only the sister of the current President Joe Biden, but she is also the one who cared for Hunter and Beau after their mother was tragically killed in the car accident that Robert was talking about earlier. So she is very, very close with Hunter and the now deceased Beau Biden, the other president's son. I do want to bring in former Deputy Assistant Attorney General Tom Dupree. And Tom, it's likely Hunter Biden is going to appeal this verdict. And based on this case, what would be some of the grounds for appeal?
Well, I think one possible ground for appeal is a Second Amendment argument that he can basically argue that the law that prohibits the sale or possession of firearms by persons under the influence of controlled substances is unconstitutional, that it violates his Second Amendment rights. It certainly would be no small irony in a year full of ironies if Hunter Biden ended up being the poster boy for an expansion of Second Amendment rights. But when you look at this trial record, I don't really see a lot of other avenues for them to pursue. I thought the evidence was fairly overwhelming against them. And so the defense's best hope on appeal might lie in trying to persuade the Court of Appeals that this whole proceeding violated his right to bear arms.
And what would be the timing on that appeals process?
Well, it would be many months at a minimum. My guess is that if sentencing is imposed sometime, as Scott was reporting, in the fall, you would probably see an appeal get underway in 2025, but I wouldn't expect to get a decision from the Court of Appeals until sometime probably late next year, late 2025 would be looking at.
And Tom, what do you think were some of the key evidence for the prosecution?
Oh, where to begin? The prosecution had a mountain of all sorts of evidence. It really was a prosecutor's dream in terms of the breadth and the scope of the evidence that they brought to bear here. They certainly had very powerful testimony from witnesses, including people who were so close to Hunter Biden throughout his life, ex-wife, ex-girlfriend, his daughter, testifying about his struggles with addiction. The jury also saw documentary evidence, the forms in question that he filled out falsely. And of course, maybe the most powerful evidence of all was Hunter Biden's own words. The jury heard his voice resonating through the courtroom, reading from his autobiography, talking about his use of crack. They also saw his text messages again. But from the prosecutor's perspective, one of the most powerful pieces of evidence you can give to a jury is to confront the defendant with his own words. And the prosecution had no shortage of Hunter Biden's own words to use against him in this case.
And then, Tom, finally, as a former federal prosecutor, do you think Hunter Biden will go to prison?
I do. I think that the sentence here is not going to be unduly severe. This is effectively a first-time offender. I suspect that the judge will look somewhat sympathetically on this case. I don't see this as a case where the judge is going to be looking at an upper range of the sentencing guidelines. My sense is that the likeliest outcome would be a sentence of incarceration, but for a fairly limited period. We'd be talking a year or two, not 5 or 6.
And then, Tom, I referenced this earlier, and the president has not been asked this or ruled this out, but could President Biden commute that sentence?
Well, he could. And I know he said at least he's not planning to pardon Hunter Biden, but keep in mind that's a promise made in May or June. And I suspect that the world will change between now and November, and President Biden may look at things very differently come November. So although, yes, the idea of a pardon or a commutation is off the table right now, I suspect it may come back with a vengeance after the election.
Tom, thank you. And just in case people don't know the difference between a pardon and a commutation, the president was asked specifically about a pardon, correct?
Right.
Yeah.
He was asked only about a pardon. And this brings us back to where we started.
And commute means to cut short, in other words, a sentence.
Ameliorate in some measure a prison sentence. But this brings us back to where we started. From a political perspective, this is a clash of the legal system and political calculations. And everyone will see that. And the president will be under tremendous political pressure not to intervene in any way to say the law applies equally and to live by that in former President Trump's case, but also intimately so, possibly heartbreakingly so in the case of his son.
We are watching Hunter Biden leave the courtroom. Now he does have Secret Service protection, and he is getting into one of those black SUVs there. I do want to bring in our political correspondent, Caitlin Huey-Burns, because she is at the White House. And Caitlin, we are expected to see the president in just a couple hours from now, correct?
Yes, that's right, Nora. He is here at the White House, but he is actually expected to speak later today on the topic of gun violence and what the administration has done to try to curb gun violence as well. He has not made any public statements about this news of the verdict. We have not heard from the White House or the Biden campaign. But I do want to remind our audience of statements that he has made in the past that give a window into his worldview on this case and the American justice system. Remember, on the day that the trial began, Biden issued a statement saying, "I am the president, but I am also a dad. As president, I don't and I won't comment on pending federal cases, but as a dad, I have boundless love for my son, confidence in him, and respect for his strength." As you also mentioned earlier, he had ruled out a pardon for his son in an interview last week. And when the Trump conviction came down, those 34 counts in the criminal case in New York, Biden also gave a statement saying that this is how the American justice system works. He said it's reckless, it's dangerous, and it's irresponsible for anyone to say this was rigged because they don't like the verdict. He also said that the American justice system is literally the cornerstone of democracy. It should be respected, and we should never let anyone tear it down. So as we await for his comments on this particular verdict, we have his comments about the verdict of his political rival and the American justice system.
All right, Caitlin Huey-Burns at the White House with that news that the President of the United States will be participating in a gun safety event along with Everytown shortly at the White House. We'll see if he makes remarks or is asked about that. Let's bring in Scott McFarlane and Erica Brown one more time. They're outside the courthouse. Scott?
The First Lady arrived at this courthouse after the verdict was read. She was a late arrival as everybody was scrambling back to this courthouse. So she ended up being in the courthouse, but not there for the reading of the verdict. But she was there, front row, so prominent throughout this trial. And you'll note that the prosecution mentioned that in closing arguments.
That's right. At the very beginning of their closing arguments yesterday, federal prosecutor Leo Wise told jurors the people sitting in the gallery are not evidence because their presence was felt in that courtroom. They were in the direct line of view of jurors, and that jurors should only consider the evidence brought forth by the prosecution and Hunter Biden's defense attorneys.
And Nora, just noting here, the family tragedy that unfolded over 7 days that the First Lady watched play out. It was Hunter Biden's brother's widow testifying about his drug use, a woman with whom he had a romantic relationship. His ex-wife, his own daughter, describing, Nora, his descent into drug addiction and all the family relationships that broke apart along the way.
Yeah, Scott and Erica, you were inside the courtroom for much of that. What was it like?
Well, I will tell you, Nora, most people in the gallery were focused on that very first row behind Hunter Biden, looking at First Lady Jill Biden, looking at members of the Biden families to see how they would react to some of the evidence that the prosecution put forth. A lot of it, the prosecution acknowledged, was very personal, very ugly, very overwhelming, but in their own words, absolutely necessary to prove that Hunter Biden was a user of drugs and an addict during this period in which he purchased and kept that firearm for 11 days. And so you could hear a pin drop in certain instances when prosecution presented evidence, especially when we heard Hunter Biden's own voice, when he read those excerpts from his book chronicling his drug use over a period of 4 years. And so people were attentive. Jurors were taking notes on large legal pads. At certain points, they were dozing off. But for the most part, they were attentive during those periods where they saw drug paraphernalia, images of drugs, videos of drugs on a scale, hearing Hunter Biden's own voice. But a lot of the attention, honestly, was in that very first row, looking at how the first family was responding and reacting to some of that evidence.
Erica Brown, Scott McFarlane outside the courthouse. Thank you so much. Just to recap, Hunter Biden, the president's son, has been found guilty on all counts. He could face as much as 25 years in prison and fines up to $750,000, according to court filings. It is, according to prosecutors and other former Justice Department officials, probably unlikely that he would get that maximum penalty. But Tom Dupree, who served in the Justice Department, just told us he believes that Hunter Biden could, in fact, get some jail time, even as a first-time offender. This is serious for the president. It's serious for his son. Jan has noted there are legitimate grounds for an appeal, but this was also, I think, probably very difficult and emotional for the Biden family to relive, as any family would, someone who has battled through addiction in such a public way.
There's a scene in Hunter Biden's memoir that he's often talked about where his father and mother, Jill Biden, his late mother, of course, passed away in '72, invite him to come to the home, and they stage an intervention. And he runs down the driveway, and he says he just keeps running and running and running, back to drug addiction, back to conduct that's incorrect or unseemly. And he acknowledges this throughout his memoir, that his father tried to intervene, tried to bring him along to change his behavior. But he is someone who's dealt with issues for a long time. And for many families who have dealt with addiction, this is a story that's all too true, all too real. And it's now playing out for the first family. But President Biden, so, and I've seen him in Delaware, he always says the value of the Biden name. You know, take my word as a Biden. Now the Biden name is, in this trial, convicted. And for someone, those who know him say it hurts. It hurts.
But, you know, I think,
Go ahead, Jane.
I just think we have to remember, too, I mean, this is kind of the culmination of what is a really bizarre series of events that started in what was initially and widely believed to be Russian propaganda. And allegations of wrongdoing in Ukraine and dirty dealing by the president's son involving the president. This was a very narrow case that was ultimately brought. It had nothing to do with President Biden. It was solely focused on that drug addiction, that drug use, signing that form, and then possessing that weapon for those 11 days in October. And like I said, I mean, this is a rare case to bring, a standalone trial, a drug addict getting a gun and then possessing a gun. But they do get brought, and there has been jail time. And to what Tom DeBree said, perhaps there will be in this case. But I do think, going back, he will have grounds for appeal, potentially good grounds. And there's a Supreme Court case right now we're waiting on that could provide additional guidance on that as well.
Nor every presidential family is part of the American family. That's the way it works. This is a tragedy for the Biden family, precipitated in large measure by the death of Beau Biden. For 8 years, the Attorney General of Delaware. Not the favored son, but the more prominent of the two sons. Hunter Biden's problems began to spiral, that is a word that is used in addiction therapy with some frequency, after Beau's death. He simply could not grapple with it. He made a ton of terrible decisions involving many members of the Biden family who had to find their way in, through, and out of this trial. That family drama played out in a courtroom in ways we have never seen before. It doesn't make it any less painful for the nation or for the family. But the verdict is now real, and the consequences will apply.
Want to bring in Scott McFarland and Erica Brown one more time, who are there outside the courthouse. What happens now?
There'll be a series of court filings, Nora, in advance of a sentencing hearing. And again, there's no firm date yet for the sentencing hearing, but the judge estimates 120 days, which is mid-October. So look in August and September for both sides to make their recommendation. Almost certainly the defense will recommend no prison time, a non-custodial sentence, they call it. They'll file their paperwork and their argument. The Department of Justice's special counsel, David Weiss, will file his recommendation, likely very late summer, potentially recommending a prison sentence. Then there is a hearing. There are arguments. Hunter Biden will be given the chance to speak and ask for leniency and ask for mercy before the judge, Mary Ellen Noreika, issues the sentence. But all of this could come in the footsteps of the 2024 election. The timing here is real.
All right, Erica Brown, thank you for all your reporting on this trial and being inside. Scott McFarland as well, thank you. Thanks to everyone here as well for your reporting and analysis. Once again, breaking news from Wilmington, Delaware. In the first ever trial of a sitting president's child, Hunter Biden is found guilty on all 3 counts in his federal gun case. The president's only surviving son was charged with 2 felonies of lying on a federal form required to purchase a firearm in 2018, and then a 3rd charge, also a felony, for being in possession of a firearm while abusing or being addicted to drugs. Hunter Biden facing up to 25 years in prison, but there is no sentencing date yet or set just yet, although Scott says it could come in about about 3 to 4 months from now. Our coverage will continue on CBS News 24/7, your local news, and then tonight on the CBS Evening News. We will hear from the president in just a couple hours from now. This has been a CBS News special report. I'm Nora O'Donnell in Washington.